Where the heck is my pin? The new uniforms we had, the breezier polos that beat the plain gray uniforms we'd been wearing by a mile, had these little pin holders on the arms where you could stash a couple of pins. They were really handy, especially since the shirts on most of the old uniforms had ink stains from just tucking them anywhere. The pants were nicer too, far more rugged and water resistant, but that's not really as relevant. The problem with the new uniforms seems to be that the pins in the arm holsters went missing. Someone had come up during mail call to get me to sign off on a request. A fairly common occurrence, but when I'd reached for my pen, I found only empty fabric. I had definitely had 2 pins earlier. I always put 2 in, and I glowered at the assembly unhappily. "All right," I said, moving around to the gathered inmates who had come to collect their mail. "Which one of you took my pen?" Inmates have notoriously sticky fingers. That's why more than a few of them were here. And when things went missing, most guards looked to the crooks for answers. I glanced around at the assembled faces and started sizing up my suspects. Hayes could have done it. The guy had quick hands and was pretty personable, but he was too far away. Caldrosa was close enough, but he only had a left hand, and I would have seen him coming a mile away. I kept scanning, and then I found him. Landro was trying his best not to be conspicuous, and he would have gotten away with it too, if he hadn't been trying quite so hard. "Landro," I called, and he jumped as I singled him out. "Where's my pen?" Landro spread his hands. "How should I know? Why would I take your pen?" I reached for my cuffs, feeling certain that I'd found my culprit. "Come on, then. We'd better do a shakedown and see if you have it or not." He started to protest, but ultimately agreed to step out into the hall for a pat search. There wasn't anything he could say when it came down to it anyway. I was the law in the dorm, and if I said search, we were searching. Someone hollered about their mail from the back of the line, and I told them to wait as I took him out into the corridor. "This is BS, Sarge," he protested, but he got against the wall and submitted. 2 bags of chips fell out of his pants, as well as a book, a towel, and in the left sock was about 5 pin middles held together with a rubber band. "Aha," I said, holding them up. "You work quick. You added my pin to your little collection while I was handing out the mail. Is that it?" Landro scoffed. "Man, you buggin'. Those ain't even your brand of pin. Check the one you still got." I turned and saw that he might have a point. The pins in the band were from cheapos, Bics and ink press pins, but both of my pins had been the gel pins, and the middles would have been much bigger than those. None of these were mine, and I handed them back before eyeing him up distrustfully. "Why were you trying to look so inconspicuous then? You were doing everything but whistling." He glanced at the pod before saying in a low voice, "'Cause those chips were my bet at poker. I didn't want Spider to know I took them out of the bag. Fool's got $50 a canteen in that sack. He wouldn't miss 2 bags of chips." I nodded. "Fine. Clean up your stuff and get lost. I'll hand out mail and provide you a distraction." He snorted. "Thanks, Sarge," he said, but only a little sarcastically. As he cleaned up his stuff, I went back to handing out mail, and Landro managed to make it back to the cell with his ill-gotten loot. I was cursing under my breath as I came back into the station, and when Rabbis looked at me and shook his head, I guessed I was being a little too angry. "What's got you in a tizzy? Someone stole one of my pins. I have a dozen Bic pins that I would have gave them, but that was a damn gel pin, and they're pretty pricey." Rabbis shook his head. "You should know better than to buy expensive pins. COs are like magpies. Everyone knows that. Just get the cheapos so when they go missing it hurts less." I went about my duties, doing rounds and fielding questions most of the night, but it seemed like every time I touched the empty spot near my shoulder, I got angry all over again. Rabbis had been right, of course. Most correctional officers were like magpies, and their proclivity for stealing most things was pretty well known. Food, drinks, and especially pens seemed to be fair game to most of them, and only a fool left their things unattended for long. I was still fuming over it when I went to go take a smoke break, and as I stood around the captain's office with a few others, one of them noticed my agitation. "What's up, Cisco? You look madder than usual." I breathed out a mouthful of smoke. "Someone stole one of my pens." A collective shrug went up that was louder than the trees beyond the fence as they rustled in the wind. "Yeah, it happens a lot. Don't leave your pens lying around," Gruber said as she took a drag off her own cigarette. "Yeah," Davis chimed in. "That's day one stuff, man." "That's just it," I insisted. "I didn't leave it lying around. It was in my pocket, right here," I said, pointing to the empty spot on my shirt. I saw Davis roll his eyes, but Case, one of the confinement guys, nodded slowly. "Yeah, I had one go missing like that, too. It's weird. I was in confinement all night, but when I reached for it during med pass, it was gone." "I had something like that happen, too," Gruber said, nodding along with the rest of us. "It's happened a couple of times, actually. It always makes me feel kind of weird when it happens." "So, how do you explain it?" Davis asked, lifting a foot to put his cigarette out on the heel of his boot. "Some ghost stealing pens or something?" Case snorted. "Maybe it's Boyd. He's kind of a weird guy, But he stopped talking and bent over his cigarette as the man in question came out of the captain's office. He turned, staring at our little group with his two big eyes, before he walked ponderously towards Edorm. Officer Boyd was an odd duck. He'd started about 6 months ago, and Captain Hannigan and the yard sergeant, Garth, had taken a liking to him. No one was quite sure why they had taken him under their wing. He wasn't particularly good at fighting, and he wasn't good at talking to inmates, but what he was good at was causing inmates to feel very uncomfortable. I'd seen it firsthand. The last fight that broke out in my dorm had seen Sergeant Garth and Officer Boyd come strutting into the quad to break up the agitated remains of the fighters. The inmates hadn't been listening when we told them to return to their cells, and had in fact started cussing at us and banging on the glass. The sergeant and his officer had come in through the back fire door, taking them by surprise, and as they gathered around them, I thought they were going to get jumped. Sergeant Garth began talking to them, laying it out how it was going to be, but what I remember was the way Officer Boyd had stared at them. He stood at Garth's shoulder, his brown eyes very large, and as he stared at the assembled inmates, they only grew wider. Sergeant Garth was talking, but the inmates weren't listening to him. Officer Boyd and his two large eyes had their full attention, and I could see many of them getting shaky the longer they looked at him. After a few minutes, they all turned and went back to their cells, and they did so quickly, like they were afraid something might come after them. Maybe they were afraid that Officer Boyd might come after them. We all parted ways after that, Officer Boyd making us feel a little uneasy, but I kept an eye on him after that. Boyd wasn't some genetic freak or anything. He wasn't a ghost or a monster or some boogin. He was just a guy. A weird guy, but still a guy. He had long legs. I don't mean that they were just abnormally long either. His body was half as large as it should be, and it made his legs look even longer. His hands seemed to be perpetually in his pockets, and I couldn't remember having ever seen them come out. His eyes were larger than I'd ever seen, and they seemed to be mostly cornea. His head was smooth like an egg, his skin pale as milk, and at the expense of sounding mean, he was just unpleasant to look at for long periods of time. As little as I wanted to, however, I kept an eye on him. It started out subtly, the way he moved around the group during briefing, the way he seemed to circle them as I watched him go. I saw him take pins from some of the officers. It was so subtle that I almost missed it, but his fingers snapped out like the mouth of a heron and took the pen before the officer had even noticed. He slid them into his pocket, looking at no one, and simply kept moving. I was shocked. Was he the one taking our pens? Why? What purpose did it serve? I didn't know, but I kept watching. Over the course of a week, I watched Officer Boyd steal no less than 30 pens. He took between 5 and 7 a day, all while having 2 of his own in his sleeve pocket. He would snap them up throughout the night. A sleeve grab here, a pen left on a desk there, even a pen dropped on the sidewalk sometimes. They all went into his pocket, jackets, pants, and it was a wonder that he didn't clatter when he walked. I knew now that he was the one taking them, but what I didn't understand was why. Why did he need so many pens? What purpose did they serve for him? I decided that if I wanted to know, I was going to have to go where he took them. The good thing about working 12-hour shifts is that you get every other weekend off. It wasn't that hard to figure out where he lived. Most of us live in town. So Friday morning, I followed him home. I know how that sounds, but I had to find out what was going on with him. If it was something illegal, then I wanted to let the prison know. Couldn't imagine what that could be, but regardless, I needed to know. It was making me crazy, and I knew I'd never be able to sleep if I didn't get to the bottom of it. I kind of expected him to live in an apartment or a trailer, but he pulled into the driveway of a very lovely ranch-style home in a suburb of Kashmir that was a few blocks from the botanical gardens. I drove past his house, watching him get out and stumble for the door, and after he went inside, I parked a few houses down on the street and crept up to his house. As I said, it was a really nice house, but it was just as weird inside as its owner. The windows had no curtains. The inside was as Spartan as it got. It was empty. No TV, no furniture, no table to eat at, and his only bit of normalcy was a fridge and a single armchair in the middle of the living room. I stayed low, but the more windows I looked through, the more I realized that he wasn't inside. I was ready to give up when I heard a strange noise from the backyard and crept up to the fence to peek through one of the slats. It wasn't hard. The fence was in disrepair, and the boards were set farther apart than I would have thought wise. But as I peeked through them, I saw where the pins had been going. In the backyard, where others might have a swimming pool, Officer Boyd had constructed a large, pointy-looking nest out of pins. It was massive, the size of an above-ground swimming pool, like you might buy at Walmart. And as I watched, I saw Boyd stand up in the middle of it. He was naked, his long legs thin and his neck slightly canted. His back was bowed, his arms were curved like wings, and he looked more like a bird than ever before. He strutted around the nest, adjusting the pins like he was trying to get the placement just right. And when he sat down below the lip of the nest, I tried not to imagine him with his head under his wing. I left not long after, not sure what to make of it. I lay awake most of the day as I tried to make sense of it all. Why had he built this nest? Was it for him? What was its purpose? Why did he need to make it out of pins? I found myself with more questions than answers, and I wondered how I could make myself face him when I went back to work. How could I face the Magpie of Stragview now that I knew too much?